So, it's a daunting process looking for a new instrument. Parents are, if it's a younger student, parents are probably rightfully sort of freaking out at the expenditures that they're looking at. You can buy the best handmade flute in the world for a few $1,000s, and you can barely get a functioning violin for a couple $1,000s. So we're going to try and simplify some of these, the different pieces that come into the puzzle of the finished puzzle of someone acquiring an instrument that they'll be happy with for a long time. It's not that difficult to acquire an instrument that you'll be happy with for a short period of time. We're going to try and make it so that it's an instrument that you can grow with and you'll be comfortable with for a long time, so you don't need to repeat this process. So, I've prepared an outline of some of the items that I'm going to talk about right now. You can download this from the website and take it with you when you go shopping for instruments if need be. There are several issues that I'm specifically not going to cover, and the reasons that I'm not going to cover them, it would probably be a whole nother video. It's really complicated, but I'm not going to talk about price. I'm not going to talk about the advantages or disadvantages of new versus old instruments. I'm not going to talk about the physical condition of the instrument. I'm not going to talk about provenance of the instrument, meaning where did the instrument come from? Is it an American instrument, a German instrument, Italian, or whatever? I am not going to talk about certification, certificates of authenticity, things like that, and or insurance valuations and insurance issues. These are all extremely important points that need to be addressed, but they will not be addressed in this particular installment of the video series. So, I think the most common problem that I've run into over the years is people go shopping for an instrument and they try the instrument as if they're a soloist. And they're playing a concerto, and the reality of it is that most people are going to be playing maybe in an orchestra, or they're going to be playing chamber music, or they're going to be playing sonatas. There aren't that many soloists out there. And so I think it's really important that people take into account what they're going to be playing and what kind of circumstances, so that an instrument that does really well for a concerto might not do very well for chamber music. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Again, all of these subjects are really complicated, and it's going to get sort of boring to hear me say I'm not going to talk about that either right now, but that's the case here. But very important, think this one through carefully. This is probably the most important decision that you're going to make in the process. And it's possibly the decision that I see leads people to needing to change instruments a year or two later. So, the next aspect that I'd like to talk about is how to go about the whole process. It's fairly complicated, and if taken as a whole, it's one of those situations where the mountain is just unmanageable, but if you do it bucket by bucket, you can handle it. And this is a perfect time to take up that type of approach. One of the things that people need to take into account is just the physical comfort of the instrument. Some instruments are bigger than other instruments. French violins are typically a little bit bigger than Italian violins. Early French violins are a little bit smaller than Violin or post-Violin period violins. Each country, their instruments are typically, they vary from country to country. or based on what model, they'll vary from size to size. The average Stradivarius violin is roughly 356, 357 millimeters in length. The average Guarneri del Gesù is 352 millimeters, maybe 353. You can commonly run into later French violins that are 360 and higher. We're talking about a few millimeters here, and it doesn't sound like much to someone who isn't going to be playing the instrument, but for the musician, these small bits and pieces, they really add up, and it can make an instrument that's uncomfortable, and even if the instrument sounds great, the musician won't be able to play it. So it's important to have an instrument that fits the person. If you've got long arms and you're a bigger person, you can handle a larger instrument just fine. But if you're small or young, think about getting possibly a little bit smaller, an instrument on the smaller range. If you pick a Guarneri model instrument, it should be a bit smaller than what you would expect to find if you're looking at a Strad pattern instrument. So the body size is very important. That's going to dictate how far the neck is, how much extension in your arm. Another factor is the actual weight of the instrument. Some instruments, you pick them up and they just feel like you're picking up a brick, and that's going to become an issue over time. If you're practicing 6 hours a day, lifting it, moving it around, it's the end of the fulcrum. You really don't want any extra weight that isn't necessary. If you've got a really heavy instrument, it might be so uncomfortable over time that it would be one of those issues that a year later you're looking for another instrument. Dimensions are very important. The standard shop dimensions, they're called New York specs, or they go in different names, but in my experience as a maker over the last 35 years at this point, my experience has been that musicians don't feel all that comfortable with what's considered standard shop measurements. Standard shop measurements for necks, for example, are bigger than most musicians feel comfortable with. And the shops, they're trying to protect their clients by having something that will wear an additional 50 years. However, if you can't play the instrument and you're looking for a new instrument a year later because you've got constant cramps in your hand, an extra 50 years of length of duration to the life of that neck it's not an issue anymore. You need to find something that you're comfortable with now and you'll be comfortable with for a long time. Again, my experience has been the standard New York specs about 1/2 millimeter smaller for the thickness of the neck, 1/2 millimeter narrower for the width of the fingerboard. It's called the thumb stop right here. If that curve isn't sharp enough, that'll cause a lot of problems because your thumb is going to be very confused where it needs to go. If you have a sharper thumb stop, your thumb gets there, it locks into position, and your hand knows where it is and it's comfortable. And if the thumb stop allows your thumb to move a little bit closer to the body of the instrument, you can reach higher up without difficulty. These are things to take into account. If you have an instrument that you've been very happy with, I would recommend that you get a shop or do the measurements yourself. Get those measurements and take those with you and compare those to what the shop can tell you about the instrument that you're looking at. The typical places to measure the fingerboard are, you measure here, right up at the nut, that should be 24 to 25 millimeters. Measure at the body, where the fingerboard joins the body, New York specs say 32 millimeters. My clients prefer roughly 31 millimeters. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but again, all of these things add up. And if you're going to be doing this for 8 hours a day, you don't want any small piece aggravating and becoming a really big piece. The dimension at the end here, we're looking at 42, 43 millimeters. That change mostly has to do with if you've got enough room so that your finger doesn't fall off the fingerboard and hit the top of the instrument. There are acoustical issues related to the fingerboard, but we won't go into those right now. The thickness of the neck is measured with a caliper, and this measurement is usually New York specs say 18.5 millimeters. 18 is plenty. And at the end of that straight section, from the top to the bottom here, that should be roughly 20 to 21 millimeters, something like that. Excuse me, I've had clients that have had cramps in their hands and trying to reach farther up, and we're in the shop and we're working together trying to find a resolution, and I'll take small shavings off of this section right here, the thumb stop, and I'm talking, half a millimeter sometimes, and it makes the difference between somebody who's very comfortable and someone who has cramps in their hand.